sometimes states don't act rationally. And I think if you look at how the United States has been behaving with regard to Ukraine in recent years, it's not rational. It just does not make good strategic sense. But I think what happened here is that the whole Ukraine war is largely a result of the period of liberal hegemony when the United States was not worried about great power politics, where it was the most powerful state on the planet and felt that it was free to do pretty much anything it wanted without worrying much about the balance of power. And in 2008, which was in the midst of the unipolar moment, we decided that we would expand NATO into Ukraine. And this was a tremendously important decision that, as both you and I have talked about before, has had catastrophic consequences. And you could make an argument that that was rational in 2008 when there was a unipolar world and the United States was in a position to think that it could push the Russians around. Uh, but what happened is that it eventually led to a major crisis in February of 2014, and of course to a war in February of 2022. And by February 2022, when that war broke out, we were no longer in a unipolar moment. We were in a multipolar world. The United States was concerned about containing China in 2022. Containment was well in place, and it made absolutely no sense to get into a war with Russia in Ukraine. But of course, that is what we did. And in fact, as you and I again have talked about on a number of occasions, the United States made no effort to avoid that war. And then once the war started, instead of stopping it, which is what the Russians were trying to do, we took steps that made sure that the war would go on. And it's still going on today. And this does not make strategic sense from an American point of view. So I think this is clearly a case of non-rational behavior. It does not accord with realist theory. And the end result is that we are in a lot of trouble. Now, my final point here, Glenn, has to go back to an observation I made a long time ago, even before I thought about what realism is. This is when I was young and the United States was involved in the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, from an American point of view, ran from 1965 to 1975. And I was in the American military from 1965 to 1975. And one of the lessons I learned back then, that's just been reinforced with the passage of time, is that it's very easy to get into wars, but extremely difficult to get out of wars. And that's especially true if you're a great power like the United States that's always worried about your reputation. So the United States gets into a place like Afghanistan, and even though it's clear for at least a decade that the United States should exit Afghanistan, it finds it extremely hard to get out of Afghanistan. It takes us 20 years to get out, even though it's clear for many years that we're going to lose the war. Uh, this is the same basic situation that we faced in Vietnam, right? It was very hard to get out of that war. And the same thing is true with Ukraine. It was easy to get into it. And the Biden administration, I think, was remarkably cavalier in thinking about how easy it would be to win that war and live happily ever after. Anyway, we got into the war and we have had a devil of a time getting out of the war. And as I said a few minutes ago, this is not rational fighting this war from an American strategic point of view. This war does not make any sense. But again, it's just so difficult to get out of it. So here we are stuck in this war. And from a Chinese point of view, to go back to China, this is manna from heaven. The Chinese, in my opinion, should hope that the war in Ukraine goes on forever. In fact, the Chinese should hope that our conflicts, America's conflicts in the Middle East, go on forever. Because as a result of our close alliance with Israel, we have to deploy large numbers of naval and air assets in the Middle East that otherwise would be deployed in East Asia. The Chinese don't want those assets in East Asia. They'd much prefer to see those naval and air assets in the Middle East. So you have this very interesting situation where the United States, which considers China to be its principal adversary and a country that it has to contain, cannot fully pivot to East Asia to contain China, not only because of Ukraine, which is what we've been talking about mainly, but also because of the Middle East and the fact that, we were in a big fight with the Houthis. We have to protect Israel if it gets into a war with Iran, and so forth and so on. So all of this works to China's advantage. So the Chinese are actually in very good shape in East Asia.
Well, yeah, this is also part of what perplexed me. That is a rational United States, which recognizes the objective of containing China as its main objective, nonetheless still spends all its resources now in the Middle East and in Europe. Uh, but could you say that the actions of the NATO countries in 2014 was rational? Because at that time, toppling the government in Ukraine, converting it into I guess, a proxy army to contain the Russians, pushing the Russians effectively out of Europe and into Asia. Wouldn't this fit within a rational perspective to prolong the unipolar moment, have collective hegemony in Europe? Now, I would say, by 2022, I think it's deeply irrational because it was quite obvious that everyone was underestimating that it was much more important for the Russians, and had also many more strategic benefits in terms of, the logistics and the actual industrial production. And even more so in 2025, nothing is rational about what's happening now. But already back in 2014, you were one of the first one who, said that this was a mistake. Why did you, why wasn't this a good strategy in your mind? The toppling Ukrainian government, building it as a proxy against the Russians, to weaken one center of power so America could focus on China instead.
Well, my view, Glenn, is that the United States should only be concerned with containing potential regional hegemons. In other words, the reason I think the United States should focus on containing China is because China is very powerful and has the potential to dominate East Asia. I think this is not in America's interest. Russia is the weakest of the three great powers in the system. Russia is not a threat to dominate Europe. I believe Russia is not a threat to conquer all of Ukraine, much less conquer territory in Eastern Europe. The Russians have never manifested any interest in conquering Eastern Europe, much less dominating all of Europe. And furthermore, they don't have the capability to do that. That's the key. If you look at Russian capabilities, if you look at the size of the Russian population and you look at Russian wealth and you even look at the size of the Russian military, they're not a threat to be a hegemon in Europe. The Soviet Union was. In 1945, the Soviet Union was by far the most powerful European country. It was sitting in the middle of Germany. It had hundreds of divisions. The United States definitely had an interest in containing containing the Soviet Union during the Cold War. But Russia is not the Soviet Union. So the United States should not be pushing NATO eastward for the purpose of containing Russia. It should not be worrying any meaningful way about a Russian threat. And if there is any Russian threat, from an American point of view, it makes sense to let the Europeans contain that threat. But again, I don't even think there's a Russian threat to Europe. I don't think there's a threat that the Germans, the French, and the British have to worry about. So I have argued from the beginning it was a huge mistake to push NATO up to Russia's border. And it was a huge mistake to countenance bringing Ukraine into the alliance. And from a Russian perspective, I thought that this would be interpreted as an existential threat. And the Russians indeed have made it clear on numerous occasions that they view this as an existential threat. So the end result would be that you would get a war that would involve the United States that the United States shouldn't be involved in because Russia's not a threat to the United States. So this is why I argued that it was foolish in the extreme to push to bring Ukraine into NATO. But I think if you go over to East Asia, it's just a very different situation. I mean, you look at the size of the Chinese population, you look at how much wealth China has, and you look at where China is in terms of developing cutting edge technologies. The Chinese are going to give the Americans a real run for their money. I think there is some reasonable chance that in the future the Chinese will be in a position to dominate Asia. That's not the case now, and I don't think it's the case in the medium term, but who knows about the long term? The Chinese are a formidable rival to the United States, and I think the United States should be concerned about China and should be interested in containing China. This is not to argue, by the way, that the United States should look to fight a war against China. The United States should go to great lengths to avoid a war with China, for sure. But the United States, in my opinion, should contain China. But again, a different logic applies in my thinking when it comes to Russia.